My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old, and my father once made me feel entirely worthless, all because I took in a young, non-verbal boy. You are out of your mind, he roared at me, slamming the front door so hard the glass rattled. You can barely even take care of yourself. I just held the little boy's hand, turned my back and walked away. But the very next morning, an impeccably dressed man pulled up to my apartment with a full team of security guards. "Are you the one who protected my son?" he asked. I nodded. And right at that exact moment my father began desperately calling my phone. I didn't answer, I just let it ring. Before we get any further into this story, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And if you have ever had to stand your ground against family members who completely underestimated your worth, please hit that like button and subscribe. The nightmare actually started the night before. It was supposed to be a traditional Thanksgiving dinner at my father Charles's massive estate in Connecticut. I arrived holding the hand of 6-year-old Leo. Leo hadn't spoken a single word since he was placed in my care through the emergency foster system a week prior. His only way of communicating was tugging at my sleeve or staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. My father didn't welcome us. He looked down at the frightened little boy hiding behind my legs, as if someone had just tracked thick mud all over his imported Persian rugs. My father is the CEO of Vanguard Asset Management. His entire existence revolves around status, power, and absolute control over his children. The moment I refused to follow his rigid plan, refused to join his corporate empire, and instead started my own small forensic accounting firm, I became the black sheep of the family. That night, the tension that had been building for years finally boiled over. "You have always been an embarrassment," Charles barked, slamming his crystal whiskey glass onto the long mahogany dining table. "Ever since the day your mother passed, you have done nothing but disappoint me. I handed you an executive position at Vanguard on a silver platter, and you walked away to open a pathetic, tiny accounting practice auditing nobodies. And now you drag this into my house." He pointed aggressively at Leo. Leo whimpered, burying his face deep into my winter coat. My sister Brittany sat across the table, swirling her expensive wine with pure disdain on her face. As the designated golden child of the family and the current vice president of Vanguard, Brittany never missed an opportunity to kick me while I was down. She leaned affectionately into her husband, disowned, an impeccably dressed man who served as my father's chief financial officer. In my father's eyes, they were the ultimate power couple, slick, ruthless, and entirely focused on accumulating wealth at any cost. "I cannot believe you dragged a disabled charity case to our holiday dinner," Brittany scoffed, adjusting her diamond necklace so the chandelier light caught it perfectly. "Cassidy, you can barely afford the rent on that rundown apartment downtown. How do you plan to provide for a child with special needs?" Andre chuckled, shaking his head with a condescending smirk. "Maybe she thinks she can audit her way into a massive trust fund," he muttered, sharing a knowing, arrogant look with my father. "You need to stop playing the savior, Cassidy. Parading around like a martyr makes our family brand look ridiculous." I squeezed Leo's small hand, years of suppressed anger making my blood boil. "I am a forensic accountant," I stated, keeping my voice dangerously level. "My job is to track missing funds, expose financial fraud, and hold corporate wrongdoers accountable. I am fully capable of supporting myself and providing a safe, loving home for a child who desperately needs it." My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face turned a deep, furious red. "Not as my daughter, you aren't. I am completely done funding your delusions of independence and dealing with your constant rebellion. You are cut off. You are out of the family. Now get out of my house before I have my security team physically remove both of you into the freezing rain." I didn't shed a single tear. I simply grabbed our coats, scooped Leo into my arms to protect him from their hostile glares, and walked out the front door, leaving my toxic family behind. I thought that was the end of the drama. I had no idea that my quiet act of defiance was about to collide with a world of wealth and power, so immense it would ultimately bring my entire family to their knees. The very next morning, I was sitting in my modest kitchen, cooking a warm bowl of oatmeal for Leo, when 3 black armored SUVs suddenly pulled up in front of my apartment building. I watched through the window as a tall, powerfully built man in a bespoke suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. He radiated an aura of absolute authority and wealth. 2 large security guards immediately flanked him as he walked straight toward my front door. When I cautiously opened it, Leo peeked out from behind my leg, gripping my jeans tightly. The imposing man instantly dropped to both knees, right there on the dirty hallway floor, completely ignoring his expensive suit. Tears welled in his eyes, shattering his powerful exterior. "Leo," he choked out, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "My boy." To my absolute shock, Leo let go of my leg and took a tentative step forward. The man didn't grab him or force a hug. He just opened his arms and waited patiently until Leo rushed forward, burying his face into the man's chest. The man stood up, holding Leo effortlessly in his strong arms, and turned to look at me. "I'm Dominic," he said quickly, regaining his composure. I recognized the name instantly. Dominic was the prominent tech and commercial real estate billionaire I regularly read about in top financial journals. "Are you the one who protected my son?" I nodded, completely stunned by the scene unfolding in my hallway. "I'm an emergency foster placement. The social worker told me he was found abandoned on the street." Dominic's jaw clenched with deep, protective anger. His mother took him over a year ago during a bitter custody battle. She completely vanished off the grid, and I've had top private investigators scouring the globe ever since. Apparently, when her stolen funds ran out, she left him at a bus station and fled the country. The state system failed to match his prints immediately. If you hadn't taken him in and kept him safe, he would have been placed in a crowded group home. Leo wrapped his arms tightly around his father's neck, but one of his hands remained firmly anchored to my sleeve. Dominic noticed the deep, immediate bond the traumatized boy had already formed with me. He reached into his inside suit pocket, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, signed a blank check and handed it to me. "Name any exact price you want," Dominic said, his intense gaze locking onto my eyes. "Move into my private estate today. I want to hire you as his permanent personal guardian to help him transition safely. And after looking into your background this morning, I also want to hire you as my chief financial consultant." Before I could even process the blank check in my hand, the sharp screech of expensive tires echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I looked past Dominic's large security guards and saw a familiar silver Bentley pull aggressively into the driveway, blocking the armored SUVs. The doors flew open, and Brittany and Andre stepped onto the pavement. They had clearly come to gloat, mock my living conditions, or deliver my father's final cruel threats. But the absolute second they recognized the famous billionaire standing on my shabby doorstep, their smug smiles vanished, and they froze completely in their tracks. The heavy slam of the Bentley doors echoed in the crisp morning air. Brittany marched across the cracked pavement in her red-bottomed stilettos, her eyes widening as she calculated the net worth of the man standing in my entryway. Andre quickly straightened the lapels of his custom suit, his predatory corporate instincts instantly kicking into high gear. They had come to gloat over my excel, but finding Dominic here presented an opportunity their greed couldn't ignore. Vanguard Asset Management was bleeding money. I knew it, and the entire financial district suspected it. They desperately needed an anchor investor to stay afloat, and Dominic was the biggest whale in the ocean. Brittany didn't even look at me. She shoved past my shoulder, hard enough to almost throw little Leo off balance. She forced a sweet, practiced smile and extended her perfectly manicured hand to the billionaire. "Dominic, what an absolute surprise to run into you here. I'm Brittany, Charles's daughter and the vice president of Vanguard. We've been trying to coordinate a meeting with your acquisition team for months." Andre stepped up right beside her, radiating the smooth, manufactured charm he used to close deals. "It's a remarkably small world, Dominic. Charles sends his highest regards. We actually have an incredible proposal that aligns perfectly with your expansion plans into commercial tech." The air around us seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dominic didn't shake Brittany's hand. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. He just left her standing there, her hand hovering awkwardly in the empty space between them. Instead, Dominic turned his broad shoulders away from the power couple. He dropped to one knee again, ignoring the dirt on the floor, and brought himself eye level with Leo. He spoke softly to his son, reassuring him that he was safe. Then Dominic looked up at me, the gratitude in his sharp eyes absolute. "Thank you for protecting him, Cassidy," he said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, intense weight. "You have no idea what this means to me." Brittany let out a sharp, offended breath, completely unable to comprehend why an industry giant would ignore her to thank the family disgrace. She finally noticed Leo hiding behind my leg, wrinkling her nose in disgust as she recognized the boy from the disastrous dinner the night before. Andre cleared his throat loudly, determined to steal back the spotlight. Dominic, I know this setting is unconventional, but Vanguard is positioned to offer you unprecedented returns. Charles specifically requested that I lead this partnership personally. Dominic stood up slowly, his towering frame completely dwarfing Andre. He signaled to his security team, and two large guards immediately stepped forward, gently escorting Leo into the climate-controlled safety of the armored SUV. As Dominic turned away for a brief second to watch his son, Andre leaned in close to my ear. His polished corporate veneer dropped, replaced by a vicious, threatening glare. "Don't ruin this for us, Cassidy," he hissed under his breath. "You owe this family your loyalty. Keep your mouth shut and let me pitch. Dad paid off your mountain of student loans to keep you off the street. The least you can do is stand aside." I didn't whisper back. I didn't flinch. I straightened my shoulders and spoke at maximum volume, making sure my voice carried across the driveway so Dominic and his security team could hear every single word. "Dad never paid a single dime toward my education, Andre," I announced clearly. "I worked 3 exhausting jobs at a time to put myself through accounting school, and I paid off my student loans entirely on my own. While you and Brittany were maxing out my father's corporate credit cards on luxury ski trips in Aspen, I was scrubbing restaurant floors and balancing ledgers until 3 o'clock in the morning." Brittany gasped, her face turning a deep, mottled red. She looked horrified that I dared to air family laundry in front of the billionaire they were desperate to impress. "Lower your voice, you lunatic," Brittany snapped, stepping toward me with her teeth clenched. "You are embarrassing us." Dominic turned around slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket, his expression completely unreadable. He looked at Andre and Brittany with absolute, chilling disdain. He saw right through their expensive clothes and hollow titles, recognizing the exact same toxic arrogance I had endured my entire life. Desperate to salvage his ruined pitch, Andre stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Please excuse my sister-in-law, Dominic. She's always been a bit unstable. She just runs a tiny, insignificant bookkeeping firm. Let's focus on the real numbers. Vanguard can guarantee a 20% return on a $100 million investment. We have the proprietary algorithms to prove it." Dominic locked his eyes onto Andre's. A slow, dangerous smile crept across the billionaire's face. "I am always open to reviewing ambitious financial proposals," Dominic said smoothly. Andre's shoulders relaxed. He shot a triumphant look at Brittany, believing his slick talk had actually worked. He reached into his jacket for a business card. "Fantastic. I can have my team send over the entire Vanguard portfolio to your office before noon." Dominic raised a single hand, stopping Andre in his tracks. "Don't send it to my office," Dominic commanded. "As of this morning, I have completely restructured my personal wealth management team. You will be submitting your entire portfolio, your proprietary algorithms, and your internal liquidity reports directly to my new chief financial consultant." Andre smiled eagerly, pen in hand. "Of course, who should I address it to?" Dominic didn't say a word. He simply raised his arm and pointed a single finger decisively and directly at me. "Submit everything to Cassidy," Dominic said, his voice booming across the quiet driveway. "She will be personally auditing Vanguard's books. If she approves your numbers, we will talk. If she finds even a single discrepancy, I guarantee nobody in the financial world will ever take your calls again." The look of absolute horror on Brittany and Andre's faces was a masterpiece. Their jaws literally dropped. The color drained from Andre's face as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. Their failing firm, their high-paying salaries, and their desperate need for a $100 million lifeline were now entirely in the hands of the sister they had thrown out into the freezing rain just 12 hours earlier. The massive iron gates of Dominic's estate closed slowly behind us, shutting out the chaos of the morning. Within a matter of hours, my life had completely turned upside down. Dominic provided Leo and me with a massive wing of the mansion. I immediately set up my forensic accounting software in the state-of-the-art home office he provided. The dual monitors hummed to life, displaying rows of encrypted financial data. Leo sat quietly at the heavy oak desk next to me, a box of crayons scattered across a large sketchbook. For the first time since I met him, the constant trembling in his small shoulders had stopped. I glanced over from my spreadsheets, watching him carefully draw a house, pressing hard onto the paper with a blue crayon. He slid the drawing toward me, watching my reaction with wide eyes. I smiled, tracing the lines of the house with my finger, and told him it was a masterpiece. He didn't say a word, but he rested his head against my arm for just a brief, fleeting second. That tiny act of trust lit a fierce, protective fire inside me. I was going to unearth the truth in Vanguard's books and make sure my family could never get close to this child or his father again. To perform a complete audit of Vanguard Asset Management, I needed the physical hard drives stored in the safe at my downtown office. Leaving Leaf safely in the care of Dominic and his tight security team, I drove into the city. My firm was located on the third floor of a modest, pre-war brick building. It was functional and entirely funded by my own sweat and countless late nights. I had just unlocked the office door and started transferring files when the heavy glass door at the front of the suite was violently shoved open. Charles strode into my reception area like a conquering general. Brittany followed close behind, wrinkling her nose in disgust as she swept her eyes over my practical furniture and inexpensive decor. My father didn't bother with a greeting. His face was twisted with an uncontrollable fury. "You ignored 17 of my phone calls, Cassidy," Charles roared, his voice echoing off the exposed brick walls. "I don't care what kind of manipulation game you are playing with that billionaire, but when I call, you answer." I calmly locked the safe and turned around to face them. "I don't work for you, Dad. I don't answer to your summons." Brittany let out a loud scoff, running a manicured finger across my reception desk to check for dust. "You act remarkably arrogant for someone operating out of an upscale storage closet," she sneered. "Andre told us everything that happened in the driveway. You actually convinced Dominic to let you review our proposal. So, here is what is going to happen next. You are going to approve Vanguard's pitch. You are going to tell Dominic that our financials are flawless, and you are going to make sure he wires that $50 million investment by Friday." I crossed my arms, staring down my golden child sister. "And if I don't?" Charles stepped forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical stature to intimidate me, just as he had done throughout my entire childhood. "If you don't, I will wipe this pathetic little hobby of yours off the map," he threatened, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl. "You seem to forget who holds the master lease on this commercial property. Vanguard Asset Management owns this building, Cassidy. I allowed you to rent this space because your mother begged me to look out for you before she passed, but my patience has run out." He slammed his hand heavily onto my desk. "You guarantee Dominic signs that contract. If you refuse, I will serve you with a 24-hour eviction notice. By tomorrow morning, I will have your computers, your files, and your cheap desk thrown onto the sidewalk. Your firm will be completely finished." A year ago, the absolute authority in his voice would have terrified me. It would have made me shrink back and apologize. But looking at the two of them now, sweating with desperation beneath their expensive clothes, I felt nothing but a cold, precise clarity. I slowly walked around my desk and sat down in my ergonomic chair. I woke up my laptop and pulled up the master property registry database I had been tracking for weeks. "You always loved dangling this lease over my head, Dad," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. "You reminded me every Thanksgiving and every Christmas that my business only had a roof over its head because of your supposed generosity. You enjoyed making me feel small." I tapped a few keys, pulling up a highly specific commercial real estate transaction from last month. I clicked on the final deed of sale. "Stop stalling and agree to Brittany's terms," Charles barked, tapping his designer leather shoe impatiently against the floor. "We have a dinner reservation in 30 minutes, and this place smells like cheap coffee." I ignored him completely. Grabbing the edge of my laptop, I casually spun the monitor around so it faced my father. "You really should keep a closer eye on what your CFO son-in-law is doing behind your back," I stated. "You don't own the master lease anymore, Dad." Charles frowned, pulling his reading glasses from his breast pocket. He leaned in closer to the screen. "What kind of fabricated garbage is this?" "It's the official county property registry," I explained cheerfully. "Vanguard Asset Management sold this entire building exactly 28 days ago. Andre authorized the quiet liquidation of 6 commercial properties to cover up massive losses and a severe liquidity crisis in your offshore accounts. You sold it to a private shell company called Blue Horizon LLC to get a desperate injection of cash." Brittany's face went pale. She looked at our father. "Dad, what is she talking about? Andre never said anything about selling properties." Charles gripped the edge of my desk, his eyes scanning the digital deed. "This is impossible. Even if de Andre liquidated the asset, the new management company still has to honor the eviction clauses. I will just call the owner of Blue Horizon directly and have them throw you out personally. I have connections everywhere in this city. I offered a slow, predatory smile that actually made my father take an involuntary step backward. I pressed the final button on my keyboard, pulling up the registration documents for the shell company. You don't need to call them, I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute satisfaction. Blue Horizon LLC is registered under my name. I used the profits from my forensic accounting contracts to buy this building through a blind trust. You don't own this building anymore, Dad. It's mine, and you are currently trespassing on my private property. The silence in my downtown office after my father and sister stormed out was intoxicating, but I had no time to celebrate. Dominic had arranged for a private car to take me back to the estate, where a massive garment bag was waiting on my bed. Dominic stood by the doorway holding a velvet jewelry box. He told me that Vanguard Asset Management would never stop at empty threats, and we needed to make a very public statement. He was attending Manhattan's annual Global Horizon Charity Gala that evening, and he wanted me by his side, not just as his guest, but as a warning to anyone in the financial world who thought I was an easy target. The custom emerald green silk gown he provided fit perfectly. When I walked downstairs, little Leo actually clapped his hands, a bright smile breaking through his usually fearful expression. I kissed his forehead, promising him I would be back before dawn. The Manhattan Gala was an ocean of flashing cameras, tailored tuxedos and diamonds. Walking into the grand ballroom with Dominic felt like stepping inside an impenetrable fortress. Billionaire senators and tech barons practically lined up to shake his hand, and he introduced me to every single one of them as his chief financial consultant. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the family disgrace. I was a respected professional holding, caught in the highest echelons of New York society. But that illusion of safety shattered instantly when a sharp, manufactured voice cut through the smooth jazz in the background. I turned to see my sister Brittany pushing through the crowd of elite guests, dragging my father and de Andre behind her. They had clearly paid an exorbitant amount for last-minute tickets, desperate to intercept Dominic. Brittany stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking over my emerald gown with absolute naked fury. She couldn't stand seeing me succeed. It violated everything she had ever been taught about her own superiority. She stepped forward, raising her voice so the surrounding circle of wealthy investors could hear every word. Dominic, what a surprise to see you here with my sister, Brittany announced, placing a hand over her heart in a theatrical display of false concern. As her family, I feel obligated to warn you. Cassidy has a long, documented history of severe psychological instability. During her university years, we constantly had to bail her out of trouble because she couldn't handle the pressure of basic coursework. She is prone to delusions and highly manipulative behavior. We are deeply concerned that she is exploiting your kindness, especially when it comes to your vulnerable son. The surrounding guests went completely silent. Whispers broke out. My father stood right behind Brittany, nodding with a solemn, fabricated look of sorrow. It was the exact gaslighting tactic they had used against me since I was 18. Whenever I outperformed Brittany, they painted me as unstable to erase my achievements. My chest tightened, a familiar panic rising in my throat. But before I could speak a single word to defend myself, Dominic stepped smoothly in front of me. He didn't look at my father. He locked his cold, calculating gaze directly onto Brittany. Psychological instability is a very serious accusation, Brittany, Dominic said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet ballroom. But speaking of delusions, let's discuss the Vanguard Charitable Foundation you currently operate. This afternoon, I had my team run a preliminary audit on your public tax filings. You claim to support underprivileged youth, yet your public records show that you spend 85% of your raised capital on administrative fees, luxury galas just like this one, and private jet travel. Less than 1% of the funds ever reach an actual child. You aren't a philanthropist. You are running a tax haven disguised as a charity to fund your wardrobe. The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was audible. Wealthy donors literally took a step away from Brittany. Her jaw snapped shut, her face turning an ugly, blotchy red as absolute public humiliation washed over her. My father looked like he was about to faint right onto the marble floor. While Dominic held the room captive, freezing my family in place with cold, hard facts, de Andre used the distraction to make a move. I caught the motion out of the corner of my eye. De Andre quickly brushed past Dominic's executive assistant, bumping his shoulder hard before offering a hurried fake apology. I watched De Andre tuck his hand back into his side, but the damage was done. Dominic signaled his security team. "We're leaving," he announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "The stench of desperation in this corner has ruined my evening." He placed a firm hand on the small of my back and guided me out of the gala, leaving my family standing there as laughingstocks. The cool Manhattan night air hit us as we slid into the back of Dominic's waiting limousine. The privacy glass rolled up, enveloping us in quiet safety. Dominic's assistant leaned over from the front seat, handing Dominic a sleek, silver USB flash drive. The assistant whispered that De Andre had slipped it into his tuxedo pocket during the commotion, whispering that it was Vanguard's proprietary pitch. Dominic scoffed, tossing the silver drive onto my lap. "Let's see what your corrupt brother-in-law thinks is worth a $50 million investment," he said, pouring us both a glass of sparkling water. I opened my laptop, inserted the drive, and bypassed De Andre's basic security encryption in less than 30 seconds. I opened the master file, containing the proprietary trading algorithm Vanguard was offering to sell. I stared at the complex lines of code, the specialized risk assessment formulas, and the unique data sequences. My blood turned completely to ice. The air left my lungs instantly. "Dominic," I whispered, my hands shaking violently as I gripped the edges of my laptop. "This isn't just an investment projection. I know this code. Exactly 5 years ago, during my final year of graduate school, I personally wrote this exact proprietary algorithm. My father told me it was worthless garbage and forced me to delete it. He stole it. Vanguard is built on my stolen intellectual labor." The adrenaline from the limousine ride kept me awake long past dawn. My father hadn't just dismissed my talent. He had stolen it, weaponized it, and built his crumbling empire on the back of my genius. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite at Dominic's estate, watching the morning light break across the manicured lawns. Today was my 33rd birthday. Under the ironclad terms of my late mother's will, today was the exact day that the private trust fund she established for me was set to unlock. It was $2 million of clean, untouchable capital, completely separate from Vanguard Asset Management. Extracting that money was the final, definitive step to cutting my ties with Charles and his corporate cult forever. I requested Dominic's driver take me directly to the financial district. I didn't wear the aggressive power suits my sister Brittany favored. I wore a simple, tailored black sheath dress that radiated nothing but absolute, terrifying calm. I walked through the heavy brass doors of Sterling Horizon Bank, bypassing the main teller lines, and walked straight to the private wealth management desks. I requested to view my mother's investment portfolio. The receptionist verified my identification, and her polite smile froze as she stared at the monitor. She quickly reached for the phone. 10 minutes later, Mr. Abernathy, the senior vice president who had known my mother personally, came rushing into the lobby. He didn't offer a warm birthday greeting. He looked absolutely terrified, a thin layer of sweat coating his face. Mr. Abernathy led me into his soundproof mahogany office and locked the door behind us. He practically collapsed into his leather chair. He pushed a single, pathetically thin manila folder across the polished wood desk toward me. When he spoke, he couldn't even look me in the eye. He stammered through a desperate apology before confirming the balance, 0. I stared at the pristine white paper inside the folder. The $2 million, the only safety net my mother had managed to secure for my future, was entirely gone. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned forward and demanded to see the complete, unredacted withdrawal logs immediately. Abernathy's hands shook violently as he pulled a secondary document from a locked drawer. The entire balance had been wired out in a single lump sum exactly 6 months ago. My finger traced the ledger lines down to the authorized signature. It read, Charles. My father had no legal access to this specific trust. My mother had explicitly written that into the bylaws. I demanded to know how a top-tier bank allowed a breach of this magnitude to occur. Abernathy wiped his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief, explaining that Charles hadn't used his status as my father. He had produced a comprehensive, notarized power of attorney. He handed me a copy of the legal decree. My vision narrowed as I scanned the bold, black text. Charles had utilized a thick stack of completely fabricated medical records, to successfully petition a well-compensated private judge. The legal document officially declared me mentally unfit to manage my own personal and financial affairs. The pieces of the puzzle from the charity gala last night clicked together with sickening clarity. Brittany's calculated outburst to Dominic about my supposed history of severe psychological instability wasn't just born out of petty jealousy. She was setting a public narrative. They had stolen my money, and they were actively trying to steal my very sanity to cover their tracks and legally bind me to their control forever. I didn't scream, I didn't shed a single tear. Crying is exactly what an unstable person would do, and I refused to validate them with a reaction. I calmly collected the fraudulent documents, slid them into my leather tote bag, thanked a hyperventilating Mr. Abernathy for his time, and walked out of the bank with my spine perfectly straight. I directed the driver straight back to Dominic's estate. My father truly believed that a forged signature and a fake psychological diagnosis would stop me. He completely forgot that my entire job is tracking missing, hidden, and stolen money. I marched back into the home office Dominic had provided for me. Leo was sitting on the rug, quietly building an intricate tower out of wooden blocks. He looked up, his dark eyes studying my face. He sensed the shift in my aura instantly. He stood up, walked over to my desk, and gently placed a single blue block right next to my keyboard. It was his silent way of showing solidarity. I smiled, whispering a quiet thank you, before locking my eyes onto the dual monitors. I cracked my knuckles and launched my forensic accounting software. I inputted Vanguard's hidden routing numbers, the exact ones I had extracted from De André's stolen flash drive the night before. I cross-referenced these internal Vanguard accounts with the destination routing numbers that had drained my mother's trust. The software hummed, lines of code racing across the screen as I pulled at the digital threads. I needed to know exactly where Charles had hidden my $2 million. He hadn't used the money to fill Vanguard's massive liquidity crisis. The timestamps on the ledger didn't match the timing of the firm's major losses. My father had stolen my inheritance for an entirely different purpose. The money trail was incredibly complex, designed to deceive federal regulators, but it wasn't enough to fool me. The $2 million bounced between 3 offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man. From there, it was laundered back into the United States, landing precisely into a domestic shell company registered in upstate New York. I entered the tax identification number into a restricted federal database I had access to. The entity wasn't a corporate asset or a real estate holding, it was a private medical clinic. I dug deeper into the clinic's public registry and state-issued licensing documents. It was an elite, highly secretive, long-term psychiatric care facility tucked away in the mountains. I pulled the clinic's payment ledgers, bypassing their basic administrative firewall. Charles wasn't just paying them off or making charitable donations. He was fully funding the permanent, involuntary confinement of a specific patient. I isolated the payment codes and opened the specific patient ledger tied to my stolen $2 million. The name on the file flashed across my screen. My blood instantly turned to ice, and the air left my lungs completely. Dominic walked into the office right at that exact moment, as I backed away from my desk. "Dominic," I choked out, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing monitor. "My mother didn't pass away in a car accident 15 years ago. She is the patient." Dominic froze behind my chair. He looked at the glowing monitor, then down at my shaking hands. He didn't offer empty platitudes or useless apologies. He immediately pulled out his encrypted phone and dispatched his elite private security team to the upstate New York clinic with strict orders: secure the facility and protect the patient at all costs. My mother was alive. For 15 years, Charles had kept her hidden away, heavily medicated and completely isolated from the world. He had spun a lie about a fatal crash to ensure he retained absolute control over Vanguard and her personal wealth. The sheer scale of the malice my father had committed threatened to overwhelm me, but I refused to let shock paralyze my mind. I took all my grief, all the years of feeling like the family outcast, and channeled it into a weapon of pure, unadulterated focus. I turned back to the dual monitors. I wasn't just an auditor seeking justice anymore. I was dismantling an empire. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing rapid bypass protocols and launching aggressive packet sniffers to mine Vanguard's deepest, most heavily defended servers. I traced the routing numbers tied to the upstate clinic, reversing the path all the way back to the Cayman shell companies, cutting through de André's pathetic digital firewalls like a hot knife through butter. I pulled up the master offshore ledger, the true, unredacted financial lifeblood of Vanguard Asset Management. The numbers cascaded down my screen like a waterfall. I isolated my stolen $2 million trust, watching the digital footprint of the money as it entered the offshore accounts. It hadn't just sat there earning interest. It had been aggressively sliced, divided, and funneled out through dozens of dummy corporations and fake vendor invoices. I set a tracking algorithm to follow every single cent, commanding the software to flag any accounts that shared a common beneficiary. The results populated instantly, drawing a massive web of absolute greed. A massive chunk of my stolen inheritance had flown directly into an untraceable LLC, registered under Brittany's maiden name. I opened the expense reports for that specific LLC, and the dramatic backdrop of my entire adult life was laid out in undeniable black and white. I saw the wire transfers for Brittany's $100,000 custom Vera Wang wedding dress. I tracked the routing numbers that purchased de André's fleet of imported Italian sports cars. I uncovered the extravagant invoices for their monthly luxury vacations to Aspen, Paris, and Dubai. While my father was telling me I was a financial burden, while he watched me work 3 minimum-wage jobs just to afford ramen and my accounting textbooks, he was actively embezzling money from my captive mother to fund the flawless, extravagant lifestyle of the golden child. Brittany had built her entire socialite persona on the back of my stolen future and my mother's forced confinement. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. But as I continued to track the flow of money, the narrative shifted from personal betrayal to corporate treason. The remainder of my $2 million balance hadn't all been spent on luxury goods. It had been used to plug a massive hole in Vanguard's primary domestic disbursement accounts. I zoomed out, expanding my forensic sweep to include all client capital inflows and dividend outflows at Vanguard over the last decade. I cross-referenced their public liquidity reports with the hidden offshore ledgers. The datasets contradicted each other completely. Vanguard claimed to the SEC and their investors that the firm was experiencing steady 20% growth annually, but the internal reality was an absolute bloodbath. They were losing money catastrophically. Their supposed proprietary algorithm didn't work at all. The tech investments de André had bragged about at the charity gala were entirely fictional. I mapped the flowchart of incoming capital versus outgoing dividend payments. A chilling, unmistakable pattern emerged on the screen. Vanguard Asset Management wasn't generating any actual profit. Charles and de André were taking the large capital deposits of new clients and instantly using them to pay out the guaranteed returns of legacy clients. They were cooking the books, fabricating growth statements, and constantly scrambling to find new victims to keep the entire house of cards from collapsing. Vanguard wasn't an asset management firm. It was a massive multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. The realization hit me like a freight train. The pieces of the puzzle were finally complete. The sudden, desperate need to sell my office building, the aggressive, uninvited ambush at my apartment, the hostile takeover attempt at the charity gala. Charles and de André were completely out of cash. Their offshore reserves had dried up, legacy clients were demanding their quarterly payouts, and Vanguard had absolutely nothing left to give them. I looked at the projected payout schedule on the left monitor. Vanguard had to secure a massive influx of untraceable liquid capital by Friday, or the SEC would detect the default, and federal indictments would follow within hours. I looked over at the $50 million investment proposal de André had slipped into the pocket of Dominic's assistant. Dominic's corporate pension fund was their target. They didn't want a strategic partnership. They needed a scapegoat to keep their Ponzi scheme alive for one more quarter, and they were planning to drain the retirement savings of thousands of Dominic's hard-working employees to do it. The printer in the corner of the office began to whir. I commanded the software to compile the final, undeniable proof of the fraud. I stood up, walked over to the tray, and picked up the single, still warm sheet of paper. It detailed the entire fraudulent cycle, complete with Charles and de André's digital authorization signatures and the exact trail of the stolen funds. I turned to Dominic. He was watching me intently, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. I handed him the paper, my hands no longer shaking. "Dominic," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any fear, "Vanguard isn't just failing. DeAndre and Charles are running a massive Ponzi scheme. They stole my algorithm to make the firm look legitimate, and their next target is your corporate pension fund. Dominic fell into absolute silence. He stared down at the sheet of paper in his hands, his eyes tracing the undeniable trail of federal crimes, offshore shell companies, and the horrific reality of my mother's imprisonment. The air in the room grew heavy with a lethal tranquility. He didn't shout, he didn't throw things. Billionaires who built empires from nothing rarely did. Instead, he raised his gaze to meet mine, and I saw a cold, calculating predator looking back at my family. "We cannot call the FBI just yet," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, precise whisper. I blinked, adrenaline still surging through my veins. "What are you talking about? I have the routing numbers. I have the forged medical decrees. They are keeping my mother locked away, and they are plotting to steal $50 million from your employees." "If we hand this over to the federal authorities right now," Dominic countered, stepping closer, "Charles will hire a dozen high-priced defense attorneys before the ink on the warrant is even dry. He will claim DeAndre acted alone. DeAndre will claim it was an algorithmic glitch. They will drag the case out. They will destroy physical evidence at Vanguard. And they might find a way to relocate your mother before my security team can secure that clinic." White-collar criminals excel at surviving in the grey areas of a long investigation. We aren't going to give them a long investigation. We are going to bury them under the weight of their own greed. He laid the paper flat across the dark mahogany desk. "We need them to commit an active, undeniable act of fraud on a monitored server," Dominic explained. "We need DeAndre to attempt to siphon funds from my network. The moment he crosses that digital threshold, the offense enters federal jurisdiction. No grey areas, no legal maneuvering." I looked at the complex network architecture displayed on the screen. "You want me to build a honeypot?" "I want you to build an absolute trap," Dominic corrected. He picked up his encrypted smartphone, tapped a few commands, and placed it on speakerphone in the center of the desk. He dialed my father's private direct line. After 2 rings, Charles answered. His voice radiated a false sense of authority, but underneath the surface I could hear the faint tremor of panic. Charles knew his offshore accounts were running out of time. "Dominic," Charles boomed, feigning casual confidence, "I didn't expect to hear from you until next week. I trust my sister-in-law hasn't caused you too much trouble. I must apologize again for her behavior at the gala. We are currently looking into getting her the help she desperately needs." My fingernails dug into my palms, leaving deep marks in my skin. Dominic didn't even blink. "Cassidy has been entirely professional," Dominic lied smoothly, his tone perfectly matching the arrogance of an interested investor. "In fact, she just demonstrated the proprietary algorithm DeAndre provided. I have to admit, I'm highly impressed. Those risk assessment metrics are exactly what I need to secure my corporate fund." A sharp intake of breath came through the speaker. I could practically see the dollar signs flashing in my father's eyes. "You are interested in moving forward with the $50 million integration?" Charles asked, unable to hide the desperate hunger in his voice. "I want to fast-track it," Dominic replied. "I don't like letting capital sit idle. I want to execute the contracts and initiate the digital handshake with your servers tonight. Bring DeAndre and Brittany to my estate at 8 o'clock. We will host a private signing dinner, finalize the integration, and toast to our new partnership." "Absolutely," Charles agreed instantly, his relief palpable. "We will be there on time. Thank you, Dominic, you won't regret this." Dominic ended the call. He looked at me, a dangerous smile creeping across his lips. "The bait is taken. Now let's set the trap." For the next 6 hours, I turned Dominic's spacious conference room into a technical dead end. I routed the main demonstration display to a hidden partition on my laptop. I created a mirrored virtual server for Dominic's corporate fund. To DeAndre, it would look like an unprotected pool of $50 million waiting to be claimed. But the millisecond his Vanguard credentials interacted with my code, the system would instantly lock him out, duplicate his hard drives, and trigger an automatic, irreversible transfer of data straight to the SEC, the FBI Financial Crimes Division, and the New York State Attorney General. While compiling the presentation that would accompany their downfall, I pulled up the receipts from their lavish lifestyles. I loaded a high-definition scan of Brittany's $100,000 wedding dress receipt and placed it directly next to the corresponding withdrawal logs from my mother's stolen trust. I paired the deeds to Andre's imported sports cars with the fraudulent medical evaluations Charles used to steal the funds. I was going to force them to look at the absolute cost of their arrogance. Just as I was finalizing the firewall parameters, the heavy oak door of the conference room creaked open. I turned away from the glowing monitors, my nerves completely on edge. Little Leo stood in the doorway. He was in his pajamas, holding a crumpled piece of paper tightly in his small hand. When he saw me, he didn't run away. He walked slowly across the long room, stopping right beside my chair. He looked up at me, his dark eyes wide and serious, and handed me the paper. I took it gently. It was a drawing made with bright, messy crayons. It showed 3 stick figures standing on a patch of green grass under a bright yellow sun, a tall man in a dark suit, a woman in a black dress, and a little boy standing between them. We were all holding hands. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down at Leo. He gave me a small, shy smile, reached out to pat my knee briefly, and then turned and trotted out of the room to find his nanny. I stared at the rough, beautiful drawing until my vision blurred. My entire life had been a lonely war. I had survived isolation, emotional manipulation, and financial theft by hardening my heart and relying solely on my own wits. I thought today was purely about settling the score for my stolen past, but looking at Leo's drawing, a profound reality sank deep into my bones. I wasn't just an auditor seeking justice anymore. Charles and Andre were coming to this house tonight to drain $50 million from a man who had offered me protection. They were coming to destroy the future of the little boy who had just drawn me into his family. They were a threat to the only real home I had ever known. I wasn't just fighting for accountability, I was fighting to protect my new family. I carefully placed the drawing at the edge of the mahogany table, right where I could see it clearly during the meeting. I smoothed down the front of my black dress and turned back to the monitors, my resolve completely ironclad. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy ring of the estate's doorbell echoed through the grand foyer. Dominic walked into the conference room, adjusting the cuffs of his custom suit. He glanced at the flashing screens, then looked at me. "Ready?" he asked quietly. I pressed the final execution key, activating the digital trap. "Let them in." We walked out to the foyer together, standing side by side at the top of the marble staircase. Dominic's head of security pulled open the massive double doors. Charles, Brittany, and Andre stepped into the entryway, dressed to the nines. Brittany wore a stunning crimson evening gown with a glittering diamond necklace, purchased, without a doubt, with my stolen money. Charles wore a tailored tuxedo, radiating the aura of a man who believed he owned the world. Andre carried a sleek silver briefcase, his chest puffed out with sheer arrogance. They looked up at us, flashing wide, triumphant smiles. They truly believed they had won. They had no idea they were walking straight into their own downfall. The heavy oak dining room doors swung open as Dominic's security staff escorted them in. Charles, Brittany, and Andre strode into the wide space, as if entering a newly conquered kingdom. The dining table was a massive stretch of polished mahogany, set with crystal and fine china that caught the warm glow of the modern chandelier above. Charles instantly marched to the seat to the right of Dominic, pulling out the chair with an air of assumed authority. He looked around the room, inflating his chest, already calculating how much of Dominic's wealth he could funnel into his offshore accounts. Brittany slid into the chair opposite him. She radiated a toxic, misplaced confidence. Andre stood at the far end of the long table, opening his sleek silver briefcase and connecting his laptop to the high-definition projection system Dominic had intentionally provided. I stood at the back of the room, hands clasped, wearing my simple black dress, projecting nothing but absolute terrifying calm. Brittany shot a glance back, her eyes raking over my plain attire with open disdain. She clearly viewed my presence as a demotion, a punishment from Dominic for causing a scene at the gala. To her, I was right back where I belonged, serving as a bystander. She snapped her fingers at me, holding up her empty crystal goblet. "Cassidy, be a dear and bring over the Pinot Noir," she ordered, her voice cutting through the quiet room. "We have complex data to discuss, and we don't need the help standing around looking useless. Try to make yourself helpful for once." I felt the gaze of Dominic's security detail instantly shift to me, their muscles tightening as they waited for my reaction. Instead, I silently walked to the mahogany sideboard, picked up the chilled wine, and poured the dark red liquid into her glass. I didn't flinch. I gave her a bright, chilling smile. Enjoy every single drop, Brittany, I whispered softly. She scoffed and turned away, completely unaware that she was drinking her final glass of wine as a free woman. My stolen money had paid for the diamonds resting on her collarbone, but my forensic code was about to pay for her reckoning. Leo sat quietly at the far end of the long table, carefully arranging his crayons into a perfect color gradient on a sheet of drawing paper. For the occasion, he had insisted on wearing a tiny custom blazer to match his father. Charles noticed the boy for the first time, letting out a heavy, irritated sigh. He leaned toward Dominic, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly across the polished wood. Dominic, Charles began, forcing a polite but patronizing chuckle. Business of this magnitude requires absolute focus and discretion. Perhaps it would be best if the nanny took the boy upstairs to his playroom. He's a bit of a distraction, and we don't want anything interrupting the flow of de André's pitch. The temperature in the dining room dropped instantly. Dominic didn't look at my father. He slowly lowered his water glass, the crystal meeting the wood with a sharp, definitive snap. "My son stays," Dominic announced, his low, deadly tone freezing de André mid-motion as he connected the server cables. "This is his home, and the woman who saved him stays by my side." Dominic extended his hand to me. I walked forward, leaving Brittany and her wine behind, and took the high-backed leather chair directly to his left. Charles swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his expensive bow tie. Unwilling to jeopardize the massive payout, he quickly forced a tight, compliant smile and nodded, though resentment burned in his eyes. De André cleared his throat, desperately trying to reclaim the energy in the room. He pressed a button on his remote, and the massive screen behind him flashed to life. He launched into a highly rehearsed, polished presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. He displayed fabricated growth charts, manipulated risk assessment models, and glowing testimonials from completely non-existent clients. He projected the very algorithm they had stolen from me, pointing to the lines of code I had written in my college dorm room, presenting my genius as Vanguard's proprietary triumph. Dominic de André said, packing the length of the table with the swagger of an experienced predator. "We initially brought you a $50 million proposal, but given the unprecedented synergy between our firms, Vanguard is prepared to absorb a $100 million capital injection from your corporate pension fund. With our specialized data sequencing, we can guarantee a 20% return year after year. Zero risk exposure, absolute market dominance. You wire the funds into our network tonight, and by tomorrow morning, your employees' retirement assets will be working harder than ever before. All we need is for you to log into the client portal I've prepared for you on this secure server." A dead silence fell over the dining room as the final, completely fraudulent slide glowed on the screen. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly under his chin, absolute greed glittering in his wide eyes. Brittany sat in the exact same posture, practically vibrating with anticipation. This was their lifeline. $100 million wouldn't just save their failing Ponzi scheme, it would elevate them to an untouchable status. They were practically salivating at the thought of emptying innocent people's retirement accounts. Dominic leaned back in his leather chair. He let the silence stretch, allowing their desperation and arrogance to reach an absolute peak. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He placed it deliberately on the mahogany table, right next to the blank signature page of the contract de André had provided. "It's a compelling pitch, de André," Dominic said, his tone entirely neutral. "The numbers are extraordinary." Charles exhaled a breath he had been holding. "We are thrilled to partner with you, Dominic," my father said eagerly, his eyes glued to the gold pen. Dominic picked up the pen, turning it between his fingers. "There is just one final protocol," Dominic said, locking his cold gaze onto Charles. "Before I sign away $100 million and initiate the digital handshake with your servers, I always have my chief forensic auditor verify the underlying network architecture." Dominic turned to me, the trap fully set and ready to spring. "Cassidy, the floor is yours." I stood up. The soft sigh of the leather chair was the only sound in the dead silent room. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at my sister. My eyes were locked entirely on de André. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out a small presentation remote. With a single, definitive click, de André's vibrant, fabricated pie charts vanished from the massive projection screen. In their place, a stark, incredibly dense spreadsheet illuminated the room. It wasn't formatted with pretty colors or slick corporate animations. It was the raw, unredacted offshore ledger I had pulled directly from Vanguard's hidden servers in the Cayman Islands just hours earlier. Row after row of data was drenched in glaring red ink. "Let's start with the first slide," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unshakable authority. Andre just promised a 20% return backed by $50 million in liquid corporate assets. I pointed the laser pointer at the top row of the spreadsheet, highlighting a specific cell. The reality paints a much bleaker picture. Vanguard Asset Management currently holds a grand total of exactly $400,000 in liquid capital across all domestic and international accounts. The remaining $49.6 million you claim to possess is entirely built on high-risk leveraged debt that you have already defaulted on. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the cascading loan structures and shell companies Charles had established to hide the hemorrhaging funds. You are borrowing against assets you don't own to pay out fake dividends to legacy clients who have no idea their initial investments evaporated 3 years ago. I continued, my tone cold as I dissected their entire operation with surgical precision. You are running a textbook Ponzi scheme, siphoning funds from new investors to cover up old lies. If Dominic wires you $100 million tonight, 80% of it will instantly and automatically be routed to cover your outstanding margin calls. Dominic won't see a single cent of return, and his employees will lose their entire retirement fund. The slick corporate veneer Andre had maintained completely shattered. Thick beads of sweat broke out across his forehead, glistening under the chandelier light. He lunged toward the table, slamming his hands flat against the mahogany. "Those numbers are completely fabricated," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he looked desperately at Dominic. He pointed an accusing finger at me. "She hacked into our systems and altered the data. Dominic, listen to me. This woman is a disgruntled, mentally unstable former employee attempting to sabotage a legitimate corporate acquisition. Turn that screen off right now." He lunged backward, frantically pounding on his open laptop keyboard, trying to regain control of the projection. A sharp error chime echoed from his speakers. He was completely locked out of his own presentation system, trapped inside the digital cage I had built for him. My father could no longer maintain his composure. Watching his crumbling empire laid out on a 100-inch screen shattered his dignified mask entirely. Charles stood up, his heavy wooden chair scraping violently against the floor. He squared his shoulders. Trying to summon the oppressive patriarch role he had used to control me my entire life. "Cassidy, sit down this instant," Charles commanded. His voice, boomed with manufactured rage, was meant to make me feel like a disobedient child rather than the forensic auditor dismantling his life. "I will not allow you to embarrass this family further with your delusions. You are sick. You are having an episode. Turn off that projector, apologize to Dominic, and leave this room before I have you forcibly removed and sent back to a facility equipped to handle your condition." 10 years ago, that voice would have made me shrink into a corner. 5 years ago, it would have made me question my own sanity. Tonight, it sounded like the dying gasp of a weak, pathetic man trying to maintain an illusion of power he no longer possessed. I ignored him completely. I didn't even turn my head to acknowledge his command. Brittany stared at the screen in sheer horror, her hand flying to cover the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone, perhaps finally realizing the true cost of her jewelry. "You're out of options, Andre," I said smoothly, cutting through his frantic typing and completely overriding my father's booming demands. "You are broke, heavily in debt, and facing imminent federal indictments for wire fraud and money laundering. But that isn't even the most insulting part of your pitch." I pressed the remote one final time. The offshore ledger vanished from the screen. In its place appeared a high-definition scan of a United States Patent and Trademark Office document, fully executed with a federal seal and dated 5 years ago. "Not only are you completely bankrupt," I announced, letting the words settle into the heavy silence of the room, "but the proprietary trading algorithm you just spent 20 minutes pitching to Dominic is my intellectual property." I highlighted the name registered on the patent document with the red light. It read clearly in bold black letters, Cassidy Wilson. I turned my head slowly, finally meeting my father's horrified gaze. My father claimed this exact code was worthless garbage during my internship and forced me to delete it from Vanguard's servers, only to steal the source code and build a multi-billion-dollar empire on the back of my work. I turned back, looking straight into de André's wide, terrified eyes. You are pitching stolen property to a billionaire. De André opened his mouth to speak, but the slick corporate charm he had relied on was completely gone. He couldn't form a single sentence. He was paralyzed. I gave him no room to recover. I pressed the remote key once more. The stolen patent document shrunk into the corner of the massive projection screen, replaced by an incredibly detailed flow chart mapping out the exact anatomy of their financial betrayal. Let's move to the third slide, I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. The mechanics of a sinking ship. You see, stealing my algorithm wasn't enough. De André couldn't figure out how to implement the code properly. When the initial investments failed to generate the promised returns, you panicked. Instead of admitting failure, you built a labyrinth of deception. I traced the bright red lines across the screen with the laser pointer, connecting deposits from Vanguard's new clients directly to the dividend payouts of Vanguard's legacy clients. I mapped the exact movement of funds over the last 36 months, transaction by transaction. The first slide displayed your bold claim of $50 million in liquid corporate assets. The reality is that you have a grand total of exactly $400,000 left across all domestic and international accounts. The rest is leveraged debt. I clicked to the next diagram, zooming in on a specific series of wire transfers. When the Seattle Teachers Union deposited $12 million last quarter, you didn't invest a single dime into tech expansion. Within 48 hours, that entire $12 million was split into 70 different payments, laundered through 3 offshore clearinghouses, and routed back into domestic accounts to pay out the guaranteed returns of your earliest investors. You aren't managing assets, I continued, my tone dropping to absolute zero. You are managing a textbook Ponzi scheme, and the walls are closing in. Your offshore reserves are completely depleted. Legacy clients are demanding their quarterly payouts, and Vanguard has absolutely nothing left to give them. You needed Dominic's $100 million tonight just to keep the lights on for another month. You were planning to use his employees' retirement fund to pay out the next round of fake dividends before the SEC detected the default and handed down federal indictments. Charles slammed his fist onto the table. The impact rattled the solid mahogany, sending crystal wine glasses clattering and spilling deep red liquid across the pristine white cloth. His face turned a violent, bruised purple, the veins bulging against his expensive silk collar. He was losing control, and for a man who built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute power, that was worse than anything. He stood up, his massive shadow looming over the table, trying to crush me with his physical presence. You ungrateful little brat, Charles roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. We gave you everything. You fabricated this because you are jealous of your sister. You've always been envious of her success, her marriage, her life. You are nothing but a bitter, unstable girl trying to destroy the family that gave you a roof over your head. I stood my ground. I didn't flinch. The frightened little girl who used to shrink away when he raised his voice, who begged for a shred of his approval, was long gone. I met his fury with absolute, freezing calm. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pressed the remote once more. The screen shifted to a split display. On the left was a high-definition scan of a legal document. On the right was a series of certified bank wire transfers I had pulled directly from the Cayman servers earlier that afternoon. You didn't give me everything, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, precise whisper that echoed off the dining room walls. You stole my mother's money to pay for de André's failures. I pointed the red laser at the document on the left. This is the power of attorney you used to seize control of her personal trust. The signature is a sloppy, arrogant forgery. The notary stamp belongs to a shell corporation registered in Delaware that dissolved 3 days after this document was filed. You used this fabricated piece of paper to lock my own mother away in an upstate clinic, keeping her heavily medicated for years. You spun a sickening, elaborate lie about a fatal car crash, just so you could declare her incapacitated and bleed her accounts dry without interference. You traded her life for liquidity. I moved the laser to the right side of the screen, and this is exactly where that blood money went. The $2 million meant for my future was wired directly into an untraceable LLC registered under Brittany's maiden name. It was that LLC that purchased de André's fleet of imported sports cars and funded Brittany's luxury holidays to Aspen and Dubai. It was that exact same shell company that plugged the massive hole in Vanguard's primary disbursement account, when your scheme almost collapsed last year. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, a harsh, ragged sound that tore through the silence of the room. She looked up at the massive screen, her wide eyes darting back and forth between the irrefutable dates on the wire transfers and the exact dates of her most extravagant purchases. The color drained from her face completely, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. The reality of her entire world, her status as the golden child, her luxurious, flawless lifestyle, was suddenly exposed as a parasitic illusion built on my mother's suffering and my stolen heritage. The diamonds resting on her collarbone suddenly looked like a heavy, glittering weight. Panic set in. She couldn't accept it. She refused to process the reality of her own complicity, the imminent destruction of her socialite empire. Brittany lunged toward Dominic, extending a trembling, manicured hand. She tried to deploy the charm that had protected her from consequences her entire life, offering a frantic, tight smile. "She's lying," Brittany pleaded, her voice high and cracking with sheer hysteria. "Dominic, you can't possibly believe this. Cassidy has always been unstable. She's manipulating the data because she hates us. Andre is a brilliant financial mind. He would never do anything like that. Right, Andre?" A suffocating silence descended on the dining room. All eyes turned to the end of the long table. Andre was still standing by his open silver briefcase, but he looked as though his very bones had turned to ash. The slick, arrogant predator who had walked into this room 20 minutes ago was completely gone. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at his father-in-law. Andre stood in absolute silence, staring at the massive projection screen in sheer, unadulterated terror. Andre's silence hung in the air like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. The polished, arrogant facade he had brought into the estate had completely melted away, replaced by the pale, clammy complexion of a man staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence. He opened his mouth, but only a faint, defeated breath escaped his lips. He couldn't talk his way out of this. There were no more fabricated charts left to hide behind. Beside him, the reality of the situation finally pierced Brittany's thick shield of privilege. She looked at the irrefutable proof of the stolen trust, then at her paralyzed husband, and finally at Dominic's cold, unreadable expression. The golden child of the Vanguard Empire suddenly realized that the ship was sinking rapidly, and she had absolutely no intention of going down with the captain. The shift was instantaneous and brutal. Brittany shoved her heavy wooden chair back, the legs scraping violently against the polished floor. She physically recoiled away from Andre, desperate to put as much distance between them as possible. "It was him," Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She pointed a trembling finger directly at her husband's face, throwing him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Andre handled all the financials. "I was just the aesthetic brand consultant for Vanguard. I don't look at the ledgers. I don't understand algorithms. I knew absolutely nothing about stolen money or offshore accounts." She turned her frantic gaze to Charles, forcing large, theatrical tears to spill over her eyelashes. "Dad, you have to believe me. He lied to us. He manipulated the entire family. He told me the money for the cars and the vacations came from his private investments. He's the criminal." The sheer speed of her betrayal shocked Andre out of his paralyzed terror. The shock on his face instantly twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The man who had spent the last 5 years catering to Brittany's every extravagant whim, breaking federal laws to fund her lavish lifestyle, was not going to be her scapegoat. "Stop playing the innocent victim, Brittany," Andre roared, his voice trembling with venom. His hand flew into his pocket, ripping out his encrypted smartphone. He tapped frantically on the screen, bypassing the locked main projection system by casting his device directly to an auxiliary smart display mounted on the side wall of the dining room. The screen flashed to life, illuminating the room in a harsh white light. "You want to talk about who knew what?" Andre shouted, stepping closer to his wife with a ferocity that made her shrink back. "Here, read these. These are the emails where you ordered me to drain Cassidy's trust so you could buy your vacation home in the Hamptons." He swiped his finger across the screen, unfolding a long chain of internal corporate communications. The text was clear for everyone in the room to see. The timestamps showed they were sent just 3 days after my mother had been locked away in the upstate clinic. The words on the screen were damning. Brittany's corporate email address was clearly visible at the top. The message read, "I don't care about the liquidity warnings, Andre. My sister is too stupid to ever request an audit, and now that my father has the power of attorney, it's ours. Wire the $2 million from her trust to the New York holding company before Friday. I am not losing the East Hamptons beachfront property to the Miller family. Get it done, or I'll find a CFO who can. The color vanished from Brittany's face entirely. She opened her mouth but no sound came out. Andre didn't stop. He swiped to the next email, his finger stabbing the glass screen. You were the one who researched the clinic for your mother, he bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain of his fury. You were the one who suggested bribing the chief physician because he was your former sorority sister's husband. You engineered the medical detention so we could access the funds to cover my margin calls. You knew every single detail of the fraud from day one. You spent the stolen money faster than I could launder it. The flawless, highly curated image of the Vanguard family was torn to shreds right in front of me. They were acting like cornered rats, viciously tearing at each other's throats in a desperate, pathetic bid for survival. Charles lunged across his chair, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He grabbed the lapels of Andre's expensive suit jacket, shaking him violently. Shut up, Charles roared, spit flying from his lips. Both of you shut your mouths right now, you're ruining everything. Dominic, please, this is an internal family dispute. We can rectify this. Let me explain the integration strategy. Nobody is explaining anything, Andre shouted, shoving Charles back. We're going to federal prison, Charles, it's over. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I watched the golden child of the family completely break down, sobbing hysterically as her husband continued to scroll through page after page of undeniable self-incrimination. I watched my father clutch his chest, gasping for air as his multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme collapsed into a pile of digital ash. I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. What I felt was the absolute weight of true accountability. Beside me, Dominic remained entirely unfazed by the screaming, the shoving, and the desperate confessions of federal crimes. He didn't even blink. He simply reached out with a steady hand, picked up his crystal goblet, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his Pinot Noir. He set the glass back onto the mahogany table, the sharp click cutting through the chaos. He casually pulled back the cuff of his bespoke suit jacket and glanced at the face of his heavy gold watch. Perfect timing, Dominic said, his deep, terrifying rumble carrying absolute authority. Before Charles could even ask what he meant, a heavy, rhythmic thud began to echo from the marble hallway outside the dining room. It was the distinct, synchronized sound of combat boots marching directly toward us. The synchronized thud of the boots grew louder, completely drowning out the frantic, pathetic arguing between Brittany and Andre. The heavy oak doors of Dominic's dining room weren't just opened, they were thrown back with an absolute, uncompromising authority. Dominic's private security detail stepped seamlessly into the shadows, clearing the path. A dozen men and women flooded into the luxurious space, creating a stark, terrifying contrast against the crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany. Half of them were clad in dark tactical gear, with the bold yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs, while the other half wore sharp, dark suits displaying SEC badges. Charles stumbled backward, his heavy wooden chair overturning and crashing violently onto the floor. His aristocratic facade crumbled instantly into an aggressive, cornered panic. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the lead agent, a tall, expressionless woman holding a thick stack of manila folders. You are making a monumental mistake, Charles roared, spit flying from his lips. He desperately straightened his custom tuxedo jacket, trying to summon the ghost of Vanguard's corporate power. I am Charles Wilson. I play golf with the governor. I have 3 state senators on speed dial. If you do not turn around and walk out of this estate right now, my legal team will personally ensure every single one of you is directing traffic by tomorrow morning. The lead agent didn't even blink. She didn't pause her stride. She raised 2 fingers in a silent signal, and tactical officers instantly flanked Charles and Andre, cutting off any possible exit route. Charles Wilson and Andre Vance, the agent stated, her voice cutting through the noise of the room with a cold, devastating precision. You are under arrest. The charges include multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, corporate espionage, and operating an unlicensed financial pyramid scheme across international borders. The agent pulled a red-tabbed document from her stack of folders, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. Furthermore, Charles, the New York State Attorney General has formally charged you with severe elder abuse, medical fraud, and unlawful confinement. State troopers have already taken control of the medical facility upstate. The patient is safe and currently in the protective custody of federal marshals. The chief physician who signed off on the fabricated psychological evaluations is already in handcuffs. Andre completely gave up. The will to fight drained entirely from his posture, leaving a hollow, trembling shell. He didn't say a single word as an agent grabbed his wrists, bringing his arms behind his back and snapping the cold steel handcuffs into place with a sharp echo. Andre stared blankly at the floor, the silver briefcase full of manufactured lies completely forgotten at his feet. Charles, however, refused to accept his reality. He violently yanked his arm away from an approaching officer. "Get your hands off me," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "You can't do this to me. I am a titan of industry. I demand my phone call. I demand my counsel." The federal agents were entirely unmoved by his outburst. Two large tactical officers stepped forward, seized Charles by the shoulders and forced him face down onto the polished mahogany dining table. Crystal wine glasses shattered, showering glass fragments and dark red wine across the white cloth. The officers twisted his arms back, forcing his wrists into cuffs. Charles let out a painful grunt, his cheek pressed firmly into the spilled Pinot Noir, his image of dignity completely destroyed. Brittany lost her mind entirely as she watched her father pinned to the table. The last remaining fragments of her golden child persona burned to ash. She dropped to her knees in her expensive crimson gown, crawling along the floor away from the table, screaming hysterically. She clutched at her hair, her flawless makeup completely ruined as mascara ran down her cheeks in dark rivers. "Don't look at me," Brittany wailed, swatting at an agent who moved to secure the perimeter of the room. "I'm the victim here. I'm a socialite. I have a reputation. You can't put me in the back of a squad car. I won't survive it." The lead agent looked down at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You aren't under arrest tonight, Mrs. Vance," the agent said coldly, "but your passport has been flagged and your bank accounts are currently frozen. Do not leave the state. We'll be seeing you very soon." Dominic sat calmly in his leather chair amidst the absolute ruin of my father's empire. He swirled the remaining wine in his glass, watching the federal agents secure the room with a detached interest, as if viewing a predictable theatrical performance. The officers hauled Charles up from the table. His custom tuxedo was ruined, stained with wine and wrinkled from the brief, violent struggle. His face was bruised and dripping with cold sweat. As the agents turned him toward the grand double doors to escort him out to the waiting transport vehicles, his heels dug into the floor. He paused, looking straight across the room at me. The malice and fury that had always lived in his eyes suddenly flickered out, replaced by a pathetic, hollow desperation. He looked at me not as a forensic auditor, but as his daughter, silently pleading for a shred of familial mercy. He was counting on me to step in, to feel sorry for the broken, humiliated man standing in the wreckage. He expected the girl he had emotionally tortured for decades to protect him. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders back, my chin held high. I felt nothing but the deep, liberating weight of justice. "You said I could barely take care of myself," I stated, my voice steady, clear and echoing with absolute finality. "It looks like I'm the only one here who actually can." The morning sun broke over the manicured hedges of Dominic's estate, casting a warm golden glow across the stone courtyard. It was a picture of absolute serenity, a sharp contrast to the ruin I had left in the dining room just 12 hours earlier. I sat at a glass patio table, my hands wrapped around a mug of dark roast coffee, watching the massive flat-screen television mounted to the wall of the outdoor kitchen. The news cycle had completely exploded overnight. Every major financial network and local channel carried the exact same headline in glaring red letters: "Vanguard Asset Management Collapses in FBI Raid." I watched high-definition helicopter footage panning over the downtown Vanguard corporate headquarters. Federal agents were rolling out boxes of physical files and pushing carts loaded with seized computer servers. The broadcast cut to ground footage captured outside the federal courthouse. Charles Wilson, the man who had demanded absolute submission from everyone around him, was being led out in a perp walk. He looked small, fragile, and utterly pathetic. His custom tuxedo jacket was severely wrinkled, and his hands, cuffed in front of him, desperately tried to block his face from the blinding flashes of the paparazzi cameras. Andre followed close behind him, his head low, looking like a terrified child. The news anchors dissected the charges with merciless efficiency. They reported in detail on the Ponzi scheme, the offshore accounts, and the devastating revelations involving my mother's medical fraud. The federal marshals had already issued a statement confirming she had been safely transferred to an elite, highly secure facility. The heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on my chest for years finally dissolved. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, complex flavor as I watched the public destruction of my former abusers. The financial fallout was swift and utterly unmerciful. The SEC hadn't just frozen Vanguard's assets, they were systematically dismantling the entire illusion of the Wilson family wealth. The broadcast shifted to a live field report outside DeAndre and Brittany's massive estate. My sister's nightmare was unfolding on national television. Federal agents had cordoned off the driveway with bright yellow tape, and 2 heavy tow trucks were actively backing down toward the massive garages. I watched with a quiet fascination as the drivers hitched up DeAndre's prized Ferrari and Brittany's custom Range Rover, hauling them away like repossessed scrap metal. The camera captured Brittany standing on the sidewalk in her ruined crimson gown from the night before, screaming hysterically at the federal agents. She had been completely locked out of her own mansion. The reporters gleefully noted that all her personal and joint bank accounts had been seized by the SEC at midnight. Her platinum credit cards were entirely frozen. The golden child who had built her entire identity on stolen wealth and artificial superiority was suddenly reduced to a weeping bystander on her own front lawn. A soft hand touched my shoulder, pulling me back from the chaotic broadcast. I turned to see Dominic standing beside my chair. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and dark trousers, looking completely relaxed despite the storm he had helped me orchestrate. "You look like a woman who finally got a decent night's sleep," Dominic said, taking a seat next to me. I offered a genuine, relieved smile. "I look like a woman who just took out the trash." Dominic chuckled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked out across the expansive lawn where Leah was happily sprinting with a golden retriever puppy, tossing a bright red tennis ball into the morning dew. The sight of the safe, joyful little boy grounded me deeply in the present moment. "Cassidy," Dominic began, his voice shifting into a deeper, more resonant register. He turned to face me, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "When you came to me with your audit, I expected a brilliant financial strategist. I expected a sharp mind capable of protecting my assets. I did not expect to meet the most powerful, formidable woman I have ever encountered." He reached across the glass table, gently taking my hand in his. His grip was warm and grounding. "You dismantled a corrupt empire without even blinking. You protected your mother, you protected my company, and you protected Leo. You didn't just survive your family, Cassidy, you conquered them." I looked down at our joined hands, feeling a swell of emotion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with peace. "I don't want you to stay here simply as a consultant," Dominic continued, his voice steady and absolutely certain. "I don't want you here as a guest. I want you to stay. I want you to be my partner in everything, in business, in this home, and in life. Leo adores you, and I adore you." Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dark velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee or make a theatrical display. He simply clicked it open, revealing a stunning, flawless emerald-cut diamond ring. It caught the morning sun, throwing brilliant fractures of light across the table. "Cassidy Wilson," Dominic said, his gaze never wavering from my eyes. "Marry me, build a real family with me." Tears strung the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of intense joy. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed his hand firmly. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and bright. "Absolutely yes." Dominic smiled, removing the ring from the box and sliding it onto my finger. It was a perfect fit. He leaned in and kissed me deeply, a reassuring promise of the life we were about to build together. For a moment, everything was flawless. Then the sharp, intrusive ring of my cell phone broke the quiet. I pulled the device from my pocket. The screen displayed an unknown number. My investigator instincts instantly flagged it. I slid the screen to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. "Cassidy," a voice rasped through the speaker. It was Brittany. She sounded completely broken, her voice raw and interrupted by hysterical sobs. The background of the call was a chaotic mix of police sirens and harsh city traffic. "Cassidy, please," Brittany begged, her breath coming in rapid, panicked gasps. "All my cards were declined. The SEC took the house. They took everything. My friends won't answer my calls. I'm at a payphone outside a downtown gas station and I have nowhere to go. Please, you have to help me. I'm your sister. I'm begging you. I gave Brittany the exact address to Dominic's outer security gates and hung up the phone. I didn't invite her in, and I didn't offer to send a car. An hour later, the skies above the estate completely opened up. A torrential, freezing rain swept across the property, turning the morning into a dark, stormy grey. I threw on a heavy waterproof trench coat, grabbed a large black umbrella, and started the long walk down the winding, tree-lined driveway. The gravel crunched steadily beneath my boots. With every single step I took away from the mansion and toward the perimeter, I could feel the last remaining strings tying me to my toxic family snapping one by one. When the massive iron security gates finally came into view, I stopped. Brittany was standing on the other side of the heavy steel bars. The designated golden child of the Wilson family, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on me from a pedestal built on stolen money, was completely unrecognizable. She was soaked to the bone. She was still wearing her expensive crimson evening gown from the night before, but the hem was torn and caked in thick black mud. Her once flawless blonde hair was plastered flat against her skull, and her designer mascara had washed down her cheeks in thick black streaks, making her look completely unhinged. She gripped the iron bars, shivering violently in the freezing rain. The moment she saw me approaching, her face twisted into a wild expression of desperate relief. "Cassidy," she screamed, her voice cracking over the downpour. "Cassidy, open the gate, it's freezing out here. Tell the guards to let me in." I stopped 3 feet away from the bars, completely dry under the wide canopy of my umbrella. I didn't signal the guard. I didn't reach for the keypad. I just stood there and looked at her. Brittany rattled the heavy iron bars, frustration instantly bleeding back into her voice. She still believed she was in control. She still believed I was the submissive little sister she could order around at will. "Are you deaf?" she demanded, her tone sharp and dictatorial. I said, "Open the gate." The federal agents took everything. They locked the doors to the mansion. They froze my offshore accounts. Even my emergency credit cards were declined. Andre's bail is set at $10 million, and I have absolutely no way to pay it. You need to wire money to his defense attorneys right now. I need a hot shower, a clean change of clothes, and a place to stay until our legal team sorts out this massive misunderstanding. I just watched her perform. From a clinical perspective, it was fascinating. Even now, standing in the mud and facing federal charges for draining her own mother's trust, she refused to accept a single ounce of accountability. She expected me to clean up her mess. She expected me to serve her. "Cassidy, please." Brittany burst into heavy tears, shifting tactics the moment she realized her demands were hitting a brick wall. Her voice turned into a pathetic, theatrical wail, and she pressed her wet face against the iron bars. "I am so scared. They're threatening me with 20 years. You have to fix this. If you had just kept your mouth shut about that stupid algorithm, none of this would have happened. But I'm willing to forgive you. We're family. We're sisters, Cassidy, and blood is thicker than water. You can't just leave me out here in the rain." I listened to her entire speech. 10 years ago, the guilt would have suffocated me. 5 years ago, I would have opened the gate and handed her my debit card. Today, standing in the storm, I felt nothing but a profound, unshakable peace. I didn't yell, I didn't snap back. The anger had completely burned out, leaving nothing but cold, hard clarity. I reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. Brittany's eyes locked onto the paper. A spark of greed and triumph flashed through her ruined makeup. She let out a wet, relieved sigh, clearly thinking I had succumbed to her manipulation. She thought it was a cashier's check. She thought it was the easy bailout money she had always received her entire life. "Thank God," Brittany sobbed, reaching her mud-stained hands through the gaps in the iron gate. "I knew you wouldn't abandon me. I knew you still cared." I stepped forward and placed the envelope directly into her trembling hands. Brittany tore the seal open with her teeth, desperate to see the numbers. She pulled out the thick cardstock, shielding it from the rain with her body, but her expression of triumphant relief instantly shattered. She blinked, staring at the document in utter confusion. It wasn't a check. It was a formal, legally binding document stamped by Dominic's elite financial firm. "What is this?" Brittany stammered, her eyes darting across the printed columns. "That is an itemized invoice," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the downpour. I locked my gaze onto her horrified face. "I personally calculated the exact amount of the $2 million you and Andre stole from our mother's personal trust. I included the specific breakdowns for the Hamptons beach house, the luxury cars, and the Dubai vacations you paid for using her medical funds. I added 5 years of compound interest, federal penalties, and the legal restitution costs you now owe me for corporate espionage. Brittany stared at the paper as the rain began to blur the black ink. Her mouth opened and closed in silent terror. You owe me $6.8 million, Brittany, I calmly stated, due immediately upon receipt. If the balance isn't settled within 30 days, my lawyers will formally attach this debt to your upcoming criminal indictment. Are you out of your mind? Brittany shrieked, gripping the iron bars so hard her knuckles turned white. She shook the gate with all the strength she had left. I have nothing left. The government took everything. I'm sleeping on the street. I can't pay this. I looked straight into her eyes, watching the final realization wash over her. She had spent her entire life pushing me down, silencing me and stealing from me. Now the roles were permanently reversed, and there would be absolute zero mercy. There is no place for you in my life anymore, Brittany, I said softly. Try a homeless shelter. I turned my back on her. I walked away without looking back once. I held my umbrella high as I walked up the long, winding gravel driveway, the steady rhythm of my boots matching the beat of my heart. Behind me, the sound of Brittany screaming and sobbing in the downpour gradually faded away, completely swallowed by the storm. The freezing rain soaking my sister washed away the final remnants of the Wilson family illusion for good. I walked back up the long gravel driveway of Dominic's estate, leaving Brittany screaming outside the iron gates, and I never looked back. Weeks after the highly televised collapse of Vanguard Asset Management, the financial landscape of the city had completely shifted. The fallout created a massive vacuum, and the business world absolutely hates a vacuum. My forensic accounting firm, which had previously operated as a quiet boutique practice, exploded overnight into an absolute financial juggernaut. The corporate elite love a winner, but they harbor a deep, reverent fear of a giant slayer. The moment the financial journals leaked the story that I was the ghost auditor who had systematically dismantled Charles Wilson's international Ponzi scheme, my phone never stopped ringing. Fortune 500 companies, massive international hedge funds, and panicked tech startups flooded my inbox. They didn't just want a standard auditor to review their books, they wanted the woman who could see through solid concrete and spot fraud from a mile away. They wanted the financial district's apex predator to bulletproof their assets. Within a month, I hired 20 new senior analysts and a dozen junior accountants just to handle the influx of contracts. In less than 60 days, our modest downtown office space was completely overwhelmed. I needed a new, formidable headquarters to house my expanding empire, and the universe delivered the most perfect piece of poetic justice. The Federal Bankruptcy Receivership was actively liquidating Vanguard's remaining physical assets at fire sale prices to begin repaying the defrauded investors. I didn't hesitate. I bought the flagship Vanguard building for a fraction of its original market value. Moving day was a quiet but deeply satisfying victory. I walked through the grand glass lobby, watching my team move boxes and set up high-end servers where Andre and his associates used to peddle lies. I took the private executive elevator straight to the top floor. The space had been completely stripped of the gaudy, ostentatious artwork and heavy velvet drapes of the past, leaving a clean, beautiful, modern canvas. I walked straight down the hallway to the massive corner office that once belonged to my father. There was still a faint, faded outline on the heavy mahogany door where his brass nameplate had hung for decades. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek, brushed steel plate of my own. It read simply, Cassidy Wilson, Chief Executive Officer. I pulled out a silver power drill and screwed the plate into the dense wood myself. Pushing the door open, I stepped behind the massive custom desk and took my seat in the leather chair. I looked out over the sweeping skyline of the city, reclaiming everything that belonged to me in the very place where I was once told I would amount to nothing. The immense peace I found in my new boardroom beautifully mirrored the profound healing happening at home. Dominic's estate had transformed from a heavily guarded fortress into a truly warm family sanctuary. Leo thrived in his new environment. The dark, fearful shadows that used to haunt his large dark eyes vanished entirely. He ran freely across the manicured gardens, playing fetch with the golden retriever puppy Dominic brought home, laughing out loud with a bright, infectious energy that filled the entire house. Yet the deep trauma of the past and years of aggressive volatility had left a lingering mark. Leo still hadn't spoken a single word. Dominic hired the best child psychologists in the state, and the consensus was unanimous. Leo would speak when his mind finally processed that he was completely, permanently safe. I refused to push him. Instead, I met him exactly where he was. Every evening after dinner, Leo and I would sit on the soft living room rug surrounded by colourful flashcards. I patiently taught him American Sign Language, turning the lessons into a game. The progress was beautiful. His small hands eagerly learned the signs for hungry, play, puppy, and tired. The major breakthrough happened on a Tuesday evening. Dominic was leaning against the doorframe, watching us with a soft smile, as Leo successfully signed his very first independent sentence. He looked straight into my eyes, his small hands moving with absolute confidence. "I am happy." I instantly signed it back to him, pulling his small body into a tight, protective hug. The absolute trust radiating from the little boy repaired pieces of my own childhood I didn't even know were broken. We were building a real family, not out of obligation, but out of choice and mutual protection. The momentum of my new life was unstoppable, but the ghosts of the past still crawled out of the corners occasionally to face their due. It was a Thursday morning, and I was leading my first high-stakes board meeting in the new penthouse conference room. 10 highly influential corporate clients sat around the custom glass table, reviewing a massive merger document. We were in the middle of dissecting a highly suspicious offshore subsidiary when my executive assistant suddenly pushed open the heavy double doors. She looked incredibly flustered, violating protocol by interrupting the meeting. She stepped in to apologize to the board, stating that there was a man in the lobby violently refusing to leave until he spoke with me. I calmly excused myself, stood up and walked out to the expansive reception area. Standing by the main security desk, drenched in nervous sweat and clutching a battered leather briefcase to his chest, was Arthur Pendleton. He was the senior bank manager who had knowingly authorized my father's fraudulent legal documents, illegally draining my mother's medical trust. His face was pale, his tie was crooked, and his hands shook so violently the briefcase dropped to the floor. The moment Arthur saw me, his legs gave out. He dropped directly to both knees onto the Italian marble floor in front of my entire staff and several waiting clients. He wept openly, begging for forgiveness, crying that federal investigators were currently searching his bank branch and threatening him with decades in federal prison for extortion and wire fraud. Arthur Pendleton, the man who had facilitated the theft of my mother's life savings, was kneeling on the polished Italian marble of my reception area. His sobs echoed off the sleek glass walls, drawing shocked stares from my high-end corporate clients and newly hired senior analysts. He clasped his hands tightly, his face slick with sweat and tears, begging me to call off the federal investigators. He claimed he was merely a victim of Charles Wilson's intimidation, a helpless pawn who had absolutely no choice but to push the fraudulent legal documents through the bank's strict approval process to save his career. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic display of a man who had sold his ethics for a bonus. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't show a single shred of sympathy. My posture remained rigid and authoritative. "You had a choice, Arthur," I said, my tone clinical and completely detached. "You were the senior branch manager. You owed a strict fiduciary duty to protect a highly vulnerable, incapacitated woman. Instead, you accepted a massive offshore kickback from my father to look the other way while he systematically drained her accounts. I tracked the wire transfers directly from Vanguard's shadow accounts to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, registered under your wife's maiden name." Arthur gasped, his eyes widening in absolute terror. He realized in that exact moment that I didn't just suspect his complicity, I possessed the documented, irrefutable proof. "I submitted your encrypted direct email communications with Charles to the FBI and the SEC 3 days ago," I informed him, crossing my arms over my dark blazer. "Your offshore accounts have been located and thoroughly frozen. You aren't just losing your job today, Arthur. You are being permanently barred from the financial industry, stripped of your licenses, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. You will never touch a ledger again for as long as you live." Arthur collapsed completely onto the floor, burying his face in his trembling hands as a long, miserable wail left his throat. I signaled to my private security team. 2 large guards immediately stepped forward, hauling the disgraced bank manager to his feet and forcibly escorting him out of my building. I smoothed the front of my blazer, turned back to my waiting clients, and seamlessly resumed my board meeting as if the interruption had never occurred. I was leaving absolutely no loose ends. Every single person who enabled my father's abuse was facing severe, unyielding consequences. As the weeks bled into months, the federal case against Vanguard Asset Management began to take its final, devastating shape. The prosecution was building an impenetrable fortress of evidence, and the pressure inside the detention center was clearly breaking the Wilson men. Andre and Charles, the two titans of industry who had once demanded absolute loyalty and submission from everyone around them, turned into terrified cowards the moment they faced real prison time. Desperate to reduce their upcoming sentences, they quickly turned on each other. When that strategy failed to yield a lenient plea deal from the prosecutors, they unanimously agreed to throw Brittany completely under the bus. The news broke on a crisp Tuesday morning. Charles and Andre's defense attorneys submitted a joint statement to the prosecution, formally claiming that Brittany was the mastermind behind the siphoning of my mother's medical trust. They aggressively accused her of orchestrating the forged documents and manipulating the bank transfers to sustain her lavish lifestyle, her luxury cars, and her Dubai vacations when Vanguard's liquid cash ran dry. The favored golden child was ruthlessly sacrificed by the men she spent her entire life idolizing. There was absolute zero honor among thieves. That same afternoon, a federal courier arrived at my penthouse office, handing me a thick manila envelope. It was an official subpoena. The United States Attorney's Office was calling me to testify as the primary forensic expert who had initially uncovered the massive web of fraud. The preparation for the trial was incredibly grueling and emotionally draining. I spent countless evenings at the federal building, sitting in stark, brightly lit conference rooms with a team of relentless prosecutors. I walked them through thousands of pages of encrypted ledgers, shell company transfers, and offshore wire receipts. Reviewing the exact methods my family used to maliciously exploit my mother brought up a lot of the dark, heavy emotions I thought I had buried long ago. The late nights blurred into an endless stream of legal strategy and financial translation. Throughout the entire ordeal, Dominic proved exactly what a real partner looks like. He didn't try to take over, and he didn't try to shield me from the hard work. He simply stood beside me like an unbreakable pillar, proving to be the steadfast reliance my family never was. On the nights I stayed late at the office building visual flow charts for the jury, Dominic would arrive quietly with takeout from my favorite local Italian spot. He would sit on the leather couch in my office, reviewing the complex legal strategies with me, playing devil's advocate to help bulletproof my testimony against any potential cross-examination. When the exhaustion threatened to break me completely, he would pull me into his arms, rubbing my tired shoulders, reminding me of the beautiful, safe life waiting for us back at the estate with Leo. He kept me grounded. He gave me the strength to keep going when the weight of my family's betrayal felt too heavy to carry. The night before the trial officially commenced, I sat at the kitchen island of Dominic's estate, reviewing my final highlighted notes. The house was wonderfully quiet. Leo was asleep upstairs, completely safe, and Dominic was in his study taking a late-night international business call. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated against the marble countertop, shattering the silence. The screen displayed an unfamiliar, out-of-state number. My investigator instincts instantly flared. I slid the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear. An automated robotic voice filled the line immediately. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the Metropolitan Federal Detention Center." My blood turned entirely to ice, but my investigator instincts kicked in immediately. I pressed the button to accept the charges, preparing myself to hear the voice of the man who had tormented me for decades. Cassidy, my father's voice, rasped through the receiver. He sounded incredibly spent, his once booming resonance reduced to a thin, gravelly echo, but underneath the exhaustion, the same old, familiar tone of manipulation remained. He used his single permitted phone call from jail to reach out, offering a twisted, highly calculated apology in a desperate, final attempt to get me to drop my testimony tomorrow. I listened to the desperate, hollow rasp of a man who had built his entire identity on dominating everyone around him, now reduced to begging from a concrete cell. Charles tried to play the card of a frail, ailing old man. He tried to invoke childhood memories, painting a bizarre, revisionist history of family vacations and supposed warmth, desperately trying to construct a bond that never actually existed. I let him speak quietly, dissecting every single word in my mind. The performance was entirely clinical. He wasn't apologizing for the immense suffering he caused. He was only apologizing because he had finally been caught. You don't love me, Charles, I stated, my voice echoing with an absolute freezing clarity. Your love was never a real emotion. It was a transaction. It was a tool you used to control, manipulate, and break the people around you until they bent to your will. But your currency is completely worthless to me now. He tried to interrupt, his voice rising in panic, but I cut through his protest effortlessly. I officially filed the legal paperwork this morning, I continued, looking out the massive kitchen windows into the dark night. I am no longer a Wilson. I legally changed my surname to permanently sever any connection to your toxic heritage. You have absolutely nothing left to protect, and you have no one left to control. Cassidy, please, Charles gasped, the illusion of authority finally shattering into genuine, pathetic terror. You didn't lose me over a business transaction, Charles. I delivered the final, fatal blow with perfect calm. You lost me the day you told me I was unlovable. Enjoy federal prison. I pressed the red button on the screen, severing the connection and erasing his voice from my life permanently. The next morning, the city air was crisp and clear. The media circus surrounding the federal courthouse was deafening. News vans lined the streets, and reporters shouted my name as a wall of cameras flashed relentlessly. Amidst the overwhelming chaos, I felt a total sense of tranquility. Dominic's hand was clasped tightly around mine, his grip firm, warm, and incredibly grounding. He walked beside me up the wide stone steps, serving as an immovable shield against the frenzy. When we pushed through the heavy mahogany double doors of the courtroom, I strode straight past the defense table where Andre and Charles sat, without giving them so much as a glance. Stepping onto the witness stand, I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The lead federal prosecutor, a sharp woman who had spent months reviewing my documentation, began her direct examination. I was articulate, precise, and completely unhurried. For 4 hours, I systematically dismantled the facade of the Vanguard asset management empire before a captivated jury. I translated complex financial jargon into a clear, undeniable narrative of absolute theft. I walked the jurors through the exact mechanics of the fraud, showing them the hidden offshore shell companies Charles had registered in the Cayman Islands. I detailed how Andre had stolen my proprietary algorithm, manipulating the code to artificially inflate Vanguard's portfolio returns and defraud new investors to pay off the old ones. Finally, I laid out the heartbreaking, meticulously documented paper trail of the systematic siphoning of my mother's medical trust. The math was absolute, the evidence was bulletproof. With every chart the prosecutor projected onto the courtroom screens, Charles and Andre visibly shrank deeper into their expensive suits. When it came time for cross-examination, Andre's high-priced defense attorney stepped to the podium. He knew he couldn't attack the numbers, so he turned instantly to character assassination. He pulled out a thick file of my past medical records, packing aggressively before the jury box. Isn't it true that you suffered from severe mental health struggles? The lawyer questioned, his voice dripping with condescension. Isn't it true that you spent years in intensive therapy, taking medication for severe anxiety and depression, harboring a deep personal vendetta against your father and brother-in-law? How can this jury trust the complex financial calculations of a woman deemed unstable by her own family? A tense silence fell over the courtroom. In the very back of the room, Dominic sat completely still, his eyes locked onto mine, radiating absolute support. I didn't flinch and I didn't look away. I did struggle with severe anxiety and depression, I stated clearly into the microphone, because I spent the first 25 years of my life surviving in an extremely toxic, emotionally abusive family that actively gaslit me to cover up their systemic crimes. They convinced me I was losing my mind so that I wouldn't trust my own eyes when I saw the discrepancies in their ledgers. The lawyer opened his mouth to object, but my voice overrode him, echoing with undeniable authority. Seeking professional help and healing my mental health didn't make me weak, I continued, locking eyes with the jury. It gave me the strength and the clarity to see exactly what they were doing in the dark. Surviving their abuse gave me the immense focus required to build the forensic model that caught your clients stealing millions of dollars. My mental health journey doesn't change the fact that on October 14th, Andre Vance wired $2 million from an incapacitated woman's medical trust directly into his personal offshore account. Math doesn't lie, counselor. Only your clients do. The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. The defense attorney froze at the podium, completely disarmed. He had tried to weaponize my trauma, and I had turned it into the very blade that sealed his client's fate. He silently withdrew the rest of his questions and sat down. The trial concluded the following afternoon. Financial fraud cases of this magnitude typically take juries days, if not weeks, to untangle and deliberate. This jury returned with a verdict in record time. Less than 3 hours after the doors closed, the foreperson handed the slip to the bailiff, and the judge read the results aloud to a dead-silent room. Guilty on all counts for both Charles and Andre Wilson. The federal judge wasted no time on dramatics or long-winded lectures. 3 weeks after the jury's lightning-fast guilty verdict, the courtroom was packed to maximum capacity for the formal sentencing hearing. Defrauded investors lined the gallery, sitting shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the final gavel to fall. The air was heavy with the reality of permanent consequences. Charles and Andre stood before the high wooden bench, completely stripped of their custom Italian suits and expensive luxury watches. They wore standard-issue, bright orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel shackles that clanked loudly against the quiet hum of the room. The judge looked down at them with absolute disdain. He cited their complete lack of remorse, the immense scale of their financial destruction, and their predatory exploitation of an incapacitated family member. Charles Wilson, the man who had spent his entire life intimidating and controlling me, was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison, with no possibility of early parole. Andre, as the primary executor of the algorithmic theft and offshore wire fraud, was hit even harder. The judge handed him a staggering 20-year sentence, noting that his specific manipulation of the proprietary code demonstrated a deep malice designed to ruin lives for personal gain. Then the court formally addressed Brittany. Because Charles and Andre had aggressively turned on her in a desperate bid for leniency, the prosecution had successfully leveled conspiracy and accessory charges against her. The favored golden child narrowly avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but her punishment was a total, systematic dismantling of her entire identity. The judge ordered the absolute liquidation of every single asset under her name to pay back the defrauded victims. Her luxury sports cars, her extensive designer wardrobe, her secret offshore emergency funds, and the deed to her penthouse apartment were completely seized by the federal government. Furthermore, she was sentenced to 1,000 hours of grueling community service and mandated to reside in a heavily monitored, low-income halfway house for the next 5 years. She was placed under a strict nightly curfew, mandatory financial audits, and a total restriction on leaving the state. The bailiff stepped forward to escort the prisoners out of the courtroom. I remained seated in the wooden gallery bench, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I watched my father and brother-in-law shuffle across the floor toward the heavy side doors, dragging their chains behind them. Charles looked incredibly frail, his shoulders completely slouched under the weight of his new reality. He was just an old, broken criminal now. Andre kept his eyes glued to the floor, his jaw clenched, refusing to look at anyone in the gallery. Brittany sat alone at the defense table, weeping silently into her hands, her perfect blonde hair tangled and unwashed. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no status, no pedestal, and no family left to bail her out. Watching them leave, I didn't feel the urge to cheer. I didn't want to gloat, mock them, or stand up and shout victory. The toxic, burning anger that had fueled my survival for a decade was completely gone. It evaporated into the stark air of the courtroom, leaving behind a profound, unshakable sense of closure. The cancer in my life had been successfully cut out. The ledger was permanently balanced. The debt had been paid in full. I stood up, smoothing the lapels of my dark blazer, and laced my fingers through Dominic's. We walked out of the federal courthouse, leaving the wreckage of the Wilson family legacy behind us, and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The drive back to the estate felt entirely different from any journey I had ever taken. I sat in the passenger seat of Dominic's car, watching the rolling city skyline pass outside the tinted window. For the past 10 years, a suffocating, invisible anvil had rested on my chest. I had built my entire existence around hypervigilance, constantly waiting for the next blow, the next manipulation, the next act of financial violence from my family. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without preparing for impact. Now, breathing in the quiet calm of the leather interior, my lungs expanded fully for the first time in a decade. The heavy burden was permanently lifted, my muscles relaxed, and a deep, genuine peace settled into my bones. Dominic drove with one hand casually on the wheel, his other hand holding mine in a firm, protective grip over the center console. He didn't ask me how I felt or try to force a deep emotional conversation. He simply provided a steady, protective presence. We pulled through the massive iron security gates of Dominic's estate, the gravel crunching beneath the tires with a familiar, welcome sound. The golden evening sun bathed the stone manor, making it look like a true sanctuary. I was finally back in the life I chose, not the one I was forced to endure. We walked up the front steps together, the deep exhaustion of the long day settling over me in a comfortable wave. Dominic unlocked the heavy front door, and we stepped into the grand, quiet foyer. I dropped my briefcase onto the entryway table and kicked off my heels, ready to fully unwind, order a massive dinner, and spend the evening playing with flashcards on the rug. But as I reached into the closet to hang my coat, a distinct sound drifted out from the adjacent living room, freezing the blood in my veins. Dominic and I stopped dead in our tracks, exchanging a look of absolute wide-eyed shock. We held our breath, standing perfectly still in the entryway, listening with intense focus to the space down the hall. The voice was clear as a bell, ringing through the soft evening hum of the house with a bright, undeniable confidence. It was a voice we had never heard before. Dominic and I dropped our coats, the heavy thud echoing against the polished marble floor of the foyer as we sprinted down the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. We rounded the corner, bursting into the wide, sunlit living room, practically sliding to a halt on the hardwood floor. Leo was standing perfectly straight, right in the dead center of the plush woven rug. He wasn't rocking back and forth. He wasn't staring blankly at the wall, trapped inside the silent, impenetrable fortress my family had coldly dismissed as permanent brain damage. He stood completely still, holding a tiny, bright red die-cast toy car up to the fading sun filtering through the windows, inspecting the light glinting off the metallic paint. As we burst into the room, he turned his head, sensing our sudden appearance. His bright, clear eyes met mine, locking onto me with an intense, beautiful focus I had never seen before. The protective glass wall that had isolated him from the world his entire life was completely gone. He took a deliberate, confident step forward, extending the tiny red car toward me. "Mamas, look, Mama." The voice was soft, slightly clumsy from years of absolute disuse, but it was absolutely perfect. The words echoed through the quiet house with the force of a sonic boom, shattering the last remaining fragments of my past trauma. My hand flew to my mouth as a raw, guttural sob tore from my throat. I dropped to my knees on the rug, completely uncaring about the fabric of my expensive suit or the exhaustion in my bones. I opened my arms, and Leo walked directly into my embrace, his small, warm arms wrapping tightly around my neck. I buried my face in his soft hair, holding him with a desperate, fierce intensity as tears of pure, unbridled joy poured down my cheeks. Dominic dropped down beside us, his massive arms wrapping securely around both of us, creating a warm, safe, unbreakable fortress. I felt Dominic's tears soaking into my shoulder as he pressed a firm kiss to the top of Leo's head, and then to mine. We stayed there, tangled in a knot of absolute happiness, letting the immense weight of the breakthrough wash over us. "Mama sees it, Leo," I whispered, my voice thick with absolute joy, pulling back slightly to smile at his grinning face. "It's a beautiful red car." This was the ultimate victory, dismantling Vanguard Asset Management and sending the men who tormented me to federal prison provided closure, but this was absolute redemption. My family had looked at my brilliant, beautiful boy and called him a liability. They labeled him broken and discarded him to protect their own selfish convenience and maintain a perfect social image. They were wrong about everything, but they were most wrong about him. We provided the safety, the patience, and the unconditional love he needed to finally feel safe enough to find his voice. 6 months later, the toxic remnants of the Wilson Empire were completely swept away, replaced by the brilliant, thriving reality I had worked so hard to build from scratch. Dominic and I were married in a stunning, incredibly private ceremony on the manicured grounds of the estate. There were no toxic relatives in attendance, no manufactured smiles for high society photographers, no transactional conversations, and absolutely zero press allowed past the gates. We stood under an archway woven with white roses, exchanging vows surrounded by a hand-picked circle of true friends and loyal colleagues who had stood by us in the darkest trenches. Leo served as our ring-bearer, proudly walking down the aisle in a miniature black tuxedo. He handed us the gold bands with a bright, confident smile and stole the show entirely, by declaring his congratulations in a clear, happy voice. He thrived, attending an elite academy specialized for exceptional children, chatterboxes filling every dinner conversation. Professionally, my forensic accounting firm became the absolute peak of the city's financial sector. The high-profile fall of Vanguard served as the ultimate, irrefutable proof of our capabilities. We rapidly expanded, hiring a massive team of elite analysts and moving into a sleek penthouse headquarters overlooking the bustling harbour. We set the absolute gold standard for corporate transparency, routinely bringing down corrupt executives and securing justice for vulnerable clients who, like my mother, had been silenced. My name was no longer tied to scandal. It became synonymous with untouchable integrity. I stood on the wide stone balcony of the master suite, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, feeling the crisp morning breeze against my face. Below me, the sprawling green lawns of the estate were fully illuminated by the golden sun. Dominic was chasing Leo across the grass, the echoes of their joyful laughter floating up to the balcony. Leo shouted with glee, dodging his adoptive father with lightning reflexes before turning to tackle him to the ground. Dominic scooped him up, spinning him through the air until they both collapsed onto the lawn in absolute, uninhibited joy. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the profound serenity of the moment anchor me completely. 10 years ago, I was a frightened, traumatized scapegoat, cast out into the cold by a family that viewed my existence as a threat to their empire of fraud. They isolated me, stripped me of resources, and tried to convince the world I was broken. They tried to crush me, silence me, and erase me from the narrative so they could keep stealing in the dark. Instead, they inadvertently forged the weapon that destroyed them. They forced me to become sharp, analytical, and absolutely unyielding. I looked down at my husband and my son, the two pieces of my heart, completely safe and thriving in the world we created together. I didn't just survive the wreckage of the past, I became the architect of my own magnificent, untouchable empire. The profound lesson throughout this journey is that true self-worth is never defined by the cruelty or limitations of the family you are born into. When faced with deep betrayal and manipulation from the people who were supposed to offer unconditional love, the greatest victory is not simply surviving the damage, but actively choosing to build a sanctuary of your own. True healing requires setting unbreakable boundaries and recognizing that walking away from a toxic environment is a profound act of self-love. Ultimately, your value comes from your resilience, your integrity, and the family you choose to surround yourself with. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries to protect your peace? How did it transform your life? Share your story in the comments below.